Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Well done for lasting the whole day in the first place. Especially well done to those of you who, like me, didn't understand most of what was being shared today. I learned a lot, I think is what my report will say. If we were on a flight right now, this would be the part of the journey where the captain would say, "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Ernst Miller speaking from the cabin. We've commenced our descent into the future, I'll have you know, because we're talking about ESG. ESG is very exciting. It's also something that often people just say we don't want to spend money or time on. We're not interested. Thank you very much. I do appreciate we are standing between you and that glass of wonderful Cape Sauvignon Blanc or Cabernet Sauvignon that you've been excited for a long time. So we're going to try and get you there quickly. We're going to try and make it a bit fun as well. For our panelists, they don't know this is coming their way, so this is where the fun's going to start. The idea was for them to each introduce themselves. The host for today has already done so. So I want to quickly ask the panelists each to just give their names again so you can match the faces with the names, because I've seen a lot of the pictures don't actually look like the people on the stage today, which was quite interesting. That's the first thing. And then the second thing, I would like them to just share one thing about themselves that you wouldn't necessarily learn from them by attending this conference today. Honey, I'm going to start with you.
Good afternoon. I'm not one to stand between you and wine. So I am Hani. I'm a wine enthusiast and a sustainability strategist. I'm looking forward to the panel.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Toma Dube. I'm an ESG specialist. One thing you wouldn't know about me by attending this conference, I really don't like podcasts anymore.
Hi, my name is Vincent. I'm a natural resource governance and ESG analyst. And I guess the one thing you probably wouldn't know about me is I have 4 younger sisters.
Hi, I'm Paula. One thing you wouldn't probably know about me is, as much as I'm an environmental lawyer, it doesn't mean I'm a tree hugger that walks around barefoot. Second quick one, although we're in Cape Town, I'm actually a fan of beer over wine.
Hi everyone, my name is Chrysanthema Mraki. I'm an investment and ESG analyst with Skybound Capital. One thing you wouldn't know about me is I'm into photography, and I've been enjoying watching you taking pictures.
Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. So you can also thank me when you get to the cocktail party after this and you don't know who to talk to and you're that random person standing around. At least you have a pickup line to start a conversation with. ESG has received a lot of attention over the last 2 years, well, at least the last decade. But there are 3 things about ESG that we want to talk to you about today that's going to surprise you. The first is ESG is not new. Although it's received a lot of attention since the turn of the century, it's actually something that's been around since the 70s and has elicited a lot of debate. Something that excited an American that I sat on a panel with in Saudi Arabia in January. It's actually a principle that was developed by a Republican lawmaker. So I'll touch on that in a second, which is different. Second, ESG is not law. ESG is an approach to business. It's about changing the way that you think about business, the paradigm that you adopt when you make investment decisions or when you just drive business practices. And the third thing about ESG that we want to surprise you on today, ladies and gentlemen, is that ESG is not about doing good. It's about developing systems and practices where you take non-financial factors into account in order to future-proof your business. And I think that's why it's fantastic that we get the last session of the day, because that's really what we're focusing. What do you need to do to change your businesses and practices to ensure that you're able to withstand shocks as they come your way? Now, for those in the audience, and just before I get on to the panelists, that think ESG is rubbish and that you don't need to pay attention to it, I'd like to invite you to go and speak to members of Rio Tinto's board of directors and their executive leadership team. Ask them what happened at Yukon Gorge a few years ago. Still don't believe me? I'd like you to go and speak to the people at Norilsk Nickel and ask them about the oil spill in the Arctic during the COVID pandemic and how much it cost them. Still not convinced? Go and talk to the people at Deutsche Bank or Volkswagen and ask them, when they put information into the public domain to try and convince their consumers or future consumers about the greenness of their products. And it turned out that that was not quite the case. What did they do to overcome the $2 billion worth of fines that they faced? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, as Lewis Powell said in 1971, when he wrote to his friend, who was the chair of the Education Committee at the US Chamber of Commerce, if we want to guarantee the continued existence of the free enterprise system, boards of directors and executive leadership teams have to think about the impact that non-financial factors have on your business models. Back then, the focus was on things like communism, because it was the 70s, it was the height of the Cold War. We were focusing on economic models, changing socioeconomic patterns. Today, it's a different world. We live in a world where we have all survived COVID, and we all have a mask hidden somewhere away in the inside of a pocket. We think differently about working online. We think differently about things like the Me Too campaign. We think a lot differently about climate change, because suddenly it's winter, but it's not cold in South Africa. Winter came late in the UK. If you have summer came late in the UK. If you have friends in London, ask them about the weather last week. If you don't believe in climate change, that's okay. But there are changing climate weather patterns. And the key focus of ESG, ladies and gentlemen, before I jump into the panel, the key thing that I want you to take away today is that it's not about the impact that your business has on people and planet. ESG doesn't care about that. Go and read the ISSB's guidance. What ESG asks is, what impact is changing people and planet patterns having on your business, and how are you adapting in order to remain viable? Now, I want to turn to the first panelist today, Vincent, who is our governance expert. Vincent, when we spoke last week, you put a lot of emphasis on the need for transparency and the role that governance plays in this process. And really, when we think about ESG, there is no E or G without, no ERS without G. But what does this mean, unless you're a nerd like me and want to think about this in your spare time?
I am a nerd like you, so let's get into it. Governance. Governance is not simply what the board does. It's not simply them chilling out, making those decisions in their smoky rooms, deciding what the future of everything's going to be, how the employees are going to be paid, or any of that stuff. No, governance is also how they navigate policies, how they navigate the rules and regulations that are facing them. How is the board taking into consideration issues like the recently signed in Climate Act? Correct me if I'm wrong. Climate Change Act, right. How is the board considering issues such as NEMA and environmental factors around emissions? How is the board considering the fact that ESCOM has a hole? Let's look at that. These are the governance issues that really, really matter. It's about aligning with not just international standards, but also local and domestic laws. And of course, there's always this complexity, this challenge. I mean, half the time they don't speak to each other. One side has the world looking into financial disclosures with the TFCD, and we're still trying to catch up on some of our climate change legislation and biodiversity legislation. There's so many different rules and norms around ESG that it becomes an alphabet soup. I mean, there's the TFCD, there is the this one thing with the task force, sustainability, whatever. It gets confusing. But it's important for the board to keep these things in mind, because these are what impacts how they can do their business. We spoke about supply chains earlier. If the board doesn't keep in mind what the impact of tariffs in the global economy is going to be on how they're moving supplies, you're not going to have your supplies to get to your consumers in time. This is where the G comes in. The G is not just about governance, it's also about trust. Trust from the people, trust from the industry, and trust with society. If you do not have that trust, how can your enterprise be sustainable in the long run? How can you actually make something functional? So, to close off, going back to what Ernst was saying earlier, the business of, the duty of the board is not to do good. The duty of business is to make and increase shareholder value. But if you're not considering those risks that you're going to face at board level, if you're not incorporating them to how you're going to behave, you're not going to be in business long. So, governance is central and key.
Thanks, Vincent. Governance, it all starts with governance, but the next step that flows from that, and then Vincent was talking about the whole alphabet soup of acronyms that can get confronted you as business every day. As a lawyer, I'm smiling all the way down the gravy train because I get to have conversations about these acronyms every day, like my fellow panelist Paula, that I'm going to hand over to in a second. But one of the key things that we've learned, either through the publication of the International Sustainability Standards Board's new sustainability and climate disclosure standards, or if you are linked to some of the European entities, I've heard some foreign accents here today, under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the accompanying European sustainability reporting standards, you have to start thinking about governance, strategy, risks, impacts and opportunities, and metrics and targets. But you have to weave all of those together, and on top of that, you need to make sense of the domestic requirements that face your business on an ongoing basis. Paula, how do we navigate this?
This thing on? Yeah. Thanks, Ernst. So Ernst started by saying that ESG is not law, but law is definitely catching up, and I'd like to spend just 3 minutes telling you about why you have to start looking at ESG through a risk lens, but as well as an impact and an opportunity lens. And these lenses need to be focused on the company from the construct of your entire value chain, as well as the region and the sector in which you operate. So there is no one-size-fits-all approach. How do geopolitical tensions affect the company's business? How does supply chain complexity affect how you do business? What are the risks of labor unrest and human rights violations throughout your value chain? How are you contributing to the financing of terrorism activities, the reduction or otherwise of greenhouse gas emissions, the increased scarcity of water? Once you really start to grapple with these issues of risks, impact, and opportunity for your business in its specific construct, do you then remove yourself from this compliance checklist activity to understanding what the value beyond compliance is from an ESG perspective? And that's the only the real way you can actually approach all these changing standards. So South Africa often grapples with this legal construct to ESG because we don't have an ESG legal framework, but we have a constitution, we have a Bill of Rights. Every operational business in South Africa is very attuned with what legal obligations they hold. But now you have all these global north or EU countries telling us that there is a deforestation regulation and a CBAM mechanism and a CSDDD, CSRDD, TCFD, and every other acronym you can think of. We automatically think those legislative frameworks or even those best practice guidelines don't apply to us because we are South African entities. But it's really important to track international legal and soft law developments for a number of reasons. One, they're starting to affect how our own countries are developing their laws. Our Climate Change Act was signed into law this morning by the President. It is our first tangible legal obligation to meet our international greenhouse gas reduction obligations at the Paris Agreement level. And it also is starting to influence how the courts the world over are interpreting different duties of care. Your director fiduciary duties are informed by our Companies Act. Great. Our Companies Act doesn't actually currently specify any ESG parameters to decision making, but the UK Companies Act does, and that was amended but a few years ago. And now all these lawyers across the world, senior legal counsel or senior advocates as we would refer to them here, are issuing dedicated legal opinions to say the scope of directors' duties must change to consider climate change and biodiversity loss within the scope of decision making. If you as a director on the board of your company now fail to adequately consider climate change in your decision making, your shareholders can take you on for a breach of fiduciary duties. Shareholder activism is very much on the rise in South Africa. And so understanding these push and pull factors and who it is, which stakeholders do you owe which obligations to, becomes very important from an ESG perspective, from a risk lens of understanding how you account for the ways in which you respond to these risks in today's day and age. And if I can have 30 seconds more, I'd just like to say that there are also non-legal risks associated with not taking ESG seriously. All the contracts that companies sign now, if you don't really read the environmental and social standards that are imposed on you, there are contractual breaches that carry significant operational financial consequences. If you just make some public commitment to reach net zero by 2050, the use of the word commitment elevates that to a guarantee and a promise to the world. You can now be taken to court for misrepresentation and fraud if you don't do that by 2050. So the risks are very real. They're not legal only in nature. They're operational, financial, and tangible.
I love lawyers because they rule by fear. They share this with you and suddenly you think, oh my gosh, I'm so exposed. How am I going to do this? They're going to take my house. There is a solution. You can have a conversation with me and Paula. We can future-proof your business for you. I want to take a step away from the draconian element that is the law and talk about where finances. The great philosopher Iago in the film Aladdin once said, "He who has the gold makes the rule." And that's where ESG focuses as well. If we think about the ESG agenda and where it came from and the report that Kofi Annan commissioned in 2004 called the Who Cares Wins report, the World Bank, IMF, other development finance institutions were all mandated to investigate what impact ESG factors should have on investment decisions. Chrysanthemum, this is where you really shine. Specifically for you, what benefits and challenges do you see in including ESG considerations into investment decisions, and why is it important?
Thank you. Well, there are always two sides to a coin. Whilst there are some challenges to implementing ESG, there are also some great benefits. So I'll just start off with some of the challenges that we have personally experienced, and I'm sure some of you who have considered ESG have come across these challenges. The first one being the lack of consistent data. For us, as we make decisions, we need to base it on metrics. However, there's a lot of inconsistency which makes it quite difficult to make decisions. The second one being the implementation costs. Integrating ESG comes with a hefty investment, but there will be benefits to it. The third one is the complexity. As you have heard from Paula, integrating ESG across your operations comes with a lot of complexity. The fourth one is the constantly evolving landscape, which creates a lot of uncertainty, and we are mostly wanting to be certain of the decisions that we make. And one of the last challenges is the skepticism that we get from stakeholders. Some people perceive ESG as a trend, but I think we need to start perceiving it as an investment approach. On the good side of the coin, some benefits of integrating ESG is lowering risk. As Paula also touched on, if you don't have anything in place, you are at a risk. And as an African company, implementing ESG aligns you with the global markets, which makes you attractive to investors. Another positive to integrating ESG is it positions you for a long-term success and as well as improvement in operational efficiencies. And the fourth one is you get a better reputation and brand loyalty, and of course that comes with financial benefits as well. And then last but not least is the investor attraction. Most of the institutional investors out there are putting big emphasis on ESG practices. So this is something we need to consider. Thank you.
Thanks, Chrysanthemum. Yeah, I think the key focus there is it really is trying to identify mechanisms that you can use to, again, future-proof your business. Honey, I'm turning to you next. You do a lot of work with boards and whip them into shape. And ESG, of course, is a topic that in the first place starts with the board when we think about the frameworks that we've been touching on today, whether the ones developed by the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, the Global Biodiversity Framework, the EU's systems again, and then also the ISSB's frameworks. How should boards and leadership teams, executive leadership teams, many of whom have members that sit in this room today, how should they think about ESG and capitalize on the benefits of ESG?
Thanks. And I'm going to start with empathizing with the speakers earlier in terms of how renewable energy and renewable energy storage is a hard sell, right? It's the same with sustainability. So I want to start with sustainability in that something that seems so common sense is not coming through as common sense to boards and executives. In that really sustainability is about a business's mainstay. And one would think something like renewable energy in support of that is mainstay. I think where we get trapped sometimes, it's in the alphabet. You know, often when I engage boards as a previous C-suite executive, and I sit on other boards, but as an advisor, I start with the F, which is missing in the ESG and as well as in the GRC from a risk. Business is about finance. It's about making money. So you make money, you do well, then you do good. I appreciate that from a G and an E of ESG, as well as social currency, it's a license to trade, right? But I usually focus on the business case of ESG and then follow on the compliance side and the long-term reputational benefit of it. And I find that when you do that, you know, because we all know numbers speak better English. When you do that, it's a lot easier to cross the hurdle.
Thanks, and I think that's the answer there. There's a big drive globally to say that they must actually extend the definition of ESG and call it EESG, and say economics, environment, governance, and social and governance. Kuma, I want to come to you last. ESG has a very real impact on the prospects of success in the space where you are active. How should developers and the manufacturers of technologies within the context of the conversations we've been having today think about ESG and, for example, align themselves with specific environmental and social management systems that our investors are looking to see are in place and to manage some of these social political risks to secure the much needed financial backing?
Okay, sure. So I guess the first point to start on, and I think we've said this quite a bit by every speaker here on this panel, is that what we're looking to do here is to future-proof the business, right? But future-proof it against what, exactly? And I think this is an important consideration by investors as well, because they appreciate the moment and what comes with that moment. The moment is that we are going through yet another industrial revolution of sorts, and it has two components. One is a technological transition, which everyone in this room is benefiting from through the energy transition. But what follows that, and quite closely, is a socio-economic shift. And part of that socio-economic shift and what policymakers and standard setters are responding to, and what now investors have to consider, is that they are going to internalize the true cost of economic activity. That true cost is the environmental and social cost that is usually borne by society that is not reflected in the cost of production, right? These policies are about internalizing that cost. And that is going into the calculus of investors when they make investment decisions. As to say, alignment to these frameworks isn't some set of criteria. It's a framework, to these frameworks with all the alphabet soup. It isn't just tick box exercises, a set of criteria that you have to meet. It's a framework that allows you to operate in a new normal where the true cost of production is factored in. And that has a real impact on the performance of an investment. And so this is how you should think about it, is that things like the carbon tax is about internalizing a cost that society is saying we no longer want to pay. And that's the socio-economic shift and the socio-political shift that is accompanying the technological transition that we're going through. Because if we just focus on the technological transition, replacing renewable coal-fired power stations with renewable energy power stations, all we are doing is trading one crisis for another. We solve the climate crisis, we create a socio-economic one, and one we are ill-prepared to contend with. This is at the forefront of investors. When they invest in businesses, they want to see that you've considered all of these things. You've considered the true cost of your operations, because your social license to operate is just as important as your regulatory approvals. They want to know that you understand that your projects also contribute to one of the biggest drivers of climate change, land use as well. Do you understand that? Does the communities that you operate in understand that as well? And will your presence in those communities create a socio-political risk later that they don't want to pay for either? And so understanding the true cost of production is what investors want to see from developers, from manufacturers. Is that factored in? Are there systems in place to mitigate some of these risks? is there a social license to operate? And is this technological transition being accompanied with good faith socioeconomic considerations?
Thanks, Uma. I want to turn to you, ladies and gentlemen, and ask you if you've got any specific questions that you want to put to our panel of experts in front of you today. All bring different experiences, different thoughts to the table. Anything specifically that's bugging you about what they shared today? The thing about ESGs is it has to be dynamic. It has to be developed in response to changing social values, changing geopolitical cycles, changing concepts. Climate change wasn't a thing in the 70s. Nature is now more of a thing than climate change is. I mean, this is incredibly impressive. If this was a lecture, I would go home and feel that I deserved my money today. Fantastic. Well, then I think at this point in time, I'm going to put one last round of questions to my panelists and ask them the very difficult question that clients often ask lawyers thinking that we own crystal balls. And that is, from each of your perspectives, given what Bloomberg said last week, that ESG is dying out, that it doesn't really matter anymore. Thank you. No, we'll be done in 5, I promise. Everything that you shared today, is it relevant? If the audience goes back to their places of business, is it worth them having conversations with their teams about ESG? And if you think it is worth so, then why? Hani, I'll start with you, and then we'll work our way down the panel to Chrysanthemum.
That's a challenge sometimes, I think, when we focus on the legalese and the terms. As you started, ESG has always existed. There is a reality, which is climate change and climate impact. We will have resource scarcity. We will have it. And for business people, I usually say, at the end of the day, is what is the cost to play in a market? And will you survive, and will you have enough resilience in the future? So to any business person, I would say, if you're not engaging in what the impact internally is to your business and vice versa, then you may be today cutting the nose to spite the face tomorrow.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess the one thing that I hope stays in the minds of everybody here, particularly about this conversation, is that ESG ultimately is about understanding your business's ability to continue to create value into the long term, considering all of these shifts. And if you think about it as about that, and you use the frameworks, the standards, the tools, the acronyms, these are tools, they are not the point. They are tools for you to arrive to one fundamental answer about your business. Will this business be able to survive into the long term and continue to create value in the way that it is today, considering the risks that we face in this transition that we're in, both politically and technologically?
Well, most of this has already been said, but let's try this. Milton Friedman once said, "The business of business is to increase and expand shareholder value. You can't increase and expand shareholder value if you're not ready for what's coming next." The same way Paul has spoken about the fiduciary risks and the fact that you can now be taken up on making a commitment to net zero, on making a commitment and claim about just how much carbon dioxide you emit per kilowatt hour of generated power, for making a commitment about your supply chain. These are things that are now serious risks and impacting on shareholder value. ESG isn't dead. It's just learning to walk again. What it was before was something that we're all thinking, okay, how do we get the money to the right places and think about these issues of finance and the environment and all of these things? Now, we're thinking about resilience. We're thinking about trust. We're thinking about mitigation of risk. And if you're not mitigating risk, you're not surviving. You're not creating shareholder value.
From my perspective, the nature of the world that we live in is constantly evolving. The principles and foundations that underpin ESG have always been there, whether you called it sustainable development or the triple bottom line or CSR or philanthropy, socioeconomic justice. It's all there and it continues to take shape based on the worlds in which we live. We're already listening and hearing about terms that have far surpassed ESG, and that's already a term of history almost. It's now resilience, it's continued stakeholder engagement meaningfully, and the last thing that I would say then, with all the financial business terminology that's happened here today, is that you don't have a future business if you don't have a planet or an ecosystem in which to operate it.
Well, most of it has been shared, but what I would say is regulations are coming. So the sooner we position our businesses and projects to be ESG compliant, the better. We will stand to have a better competitive edge. So let us take on this commitment and start on this work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Freedom International Airport. We hope you enjoyed your stay with us today and your travels. We look forward to welcoming you on board again in future if you implement a sound ESG framework. Thank you and goodbye.
Ladies and gentlemen, as our panelists take off, and I invite our photographer to take the official picture.